joining us over the summer or you're just popping in for this Sunday, we have been working through a series on the book of Psalms. And the Psalms is a real interesting part of the Bible, as what we begin to see is various expressions of people's faith coming out in very honest and authentic ways. As people share the various emotions based upon the circumstances and the situations that they find themselves in. And one of the phrases that I've really kind of latched on to, that I've heard from others, is in the Psalms, we essentially see people getting beyond the small talk with God. That they begin to, in real honest ways, share what is going on deep within. And our hope is that as we have been looking into the various types of Psalms, the various expressions of people's faith and the emotions that have been going on, that we are given an opportunity to begin to model this in our lives as well. So that we get to a real, authentic relationship with God. By not simply sharing what we think He expects to hear from us, but by honestly sharing that which is going on within us as well. And so this morning we're going to read from Psalm 58. If you don't have a Bible, there's Bibles in the pew in front of you. Just break it into the middle and find number 58. But let me read these words to you. Do you rulers indeed speak justly? Do you judge uprightly among men? No, in your heart you devise injustice, and your hands met out violence on the earth. Even from birth the wicked go astray. From the womb they are wayward and speak lies. Their venom is like the venom of a snake, like that of a cobra that has stopped its ears, that will not heed the tune of the charmer, however skillful the enchanter may be. Break the teeth in their mouths, O God. Tear out, O Lord, the fangs of the lions. Let them vanish like water that flows away. When they draw the bow, let their arrows be blunted. Like a slug melting away as it moves along. Like a stillborn child, may they not see the sun. Before your pots can feel the heat of the thorns, whether it be green or dry, the wicked will be swept away. The righteous will be glad when they are avenged, when they bathe their feet in the blood of the wicked. Then men will say, surely the righteous still are rewarded. Surely there is a God who judges the earth. Amen. Well, we've read a lot of Psalms this summer. And that's perhaps one of those Psalms that you just hear it for the first time, or as you read and followed along, you're thinking, is that really in the Bible? Did we really just hear those words? I think one of the helpful things that we do is when we come to Scripture, when we come to God's Word, is we really wrestle with everything that He gives to us. And as I was hearing this and reading this past week, I was reminded of a phrase that I heard a number of years ago that really kind of fits what this psalm is all about. I find it interesting that in various cultures and perhaps in various families, we have different phrases that we use to describe something that is going on. And oftentimes we understand it and we get it, and so when someone says that phrase, we know exactly what they mean. But if you're new to the context, if you're new to the family or you're new to the situation, someone may say something that either totally confuses you or even worse, means something entirely different to you. I've run into this on a few occasions in my life. A number of years ago when we were still living in Malawi, very early on, we invited a number of Malawians into our home for dinner. And it was potluck, and they brought all this amazing food, and the food was sitting on the table. And after a few kind of words of greeting, and I prayed for the food, I simply said, okay, food is ready. Come and help yourself. Now, I'm sure if I invited you over to my home here this afternoon, if I said, come and help yourself, what would be your immediate reaction? You would come and help yourself. You would come and get some food, and you would sit down, and you would start eating. Well, I said that, and there was silence. And I'm thinking, Oh, maybe they didn't hear me. Food is ready. You know how you do that? You say the exact same thing, but you just say it slower and louder, and you think you're getting your point across. That was me. Food is ready. Come and help yourself. Silence. Met with awkwardness. Met with looks of, this guy they sent us from Canada, maybe we should send him back. Graciously, one of the Malawian men walked up to me and said, Joel, I don't know what come and help yourself means in Canada, but in Malawi, it means go to the bathroom. So whatever else you take from me here this morning, if ever traveling in the southern part of Africa, if you say to someone, come and help yourself, you're inviting them to the bathroom. But on another occasion, we were having dinner, and there was 2 Australian gentlemen that were joining us. And this one guy was telling this story, and he was getting more and more emotional as he was telling this story and setting up this scenario where clearly this person was just getting more and more frustrated and just aggravated. And suddenly the guy says, and you know what he did, Joel? He chucked a wobbly. And I'm like, he chucked a what? And Rebecca and I are looking at each other, and now we knew how those Malawians were feeling because I didn't know what. And I said, I have no idea. Apparently in Australia, a chuck a wobbly means a fit of rage. That if you have completely lost your mind, you chuck a wobbly. So maybe a second helpful piece of advice, if someone's about to lose it on you here this coming week, say, hey, don't get so upset. Don't chuck a wobbly on me. When I read Psalm 58, it seems as if the writer has just chucked a wobbly on God. Absolutely gone off. We may not know or appreciate the circumstances, but clearly what is happening is there is significant injustice occurring. There's this sense of anger because the people that are in places of power and authority are not using their positions to help and to serve others. Rather, they are using it for their own benefit. They are exacting violence onto individuals. And the psalmist uses such imagination. He says, they are like cobras that are spitting venom. And so the psalmist goes on to say, God, you got to do something. You have to break their teeth. You have to rip them out. I mean, those are pretty descriptive words. He says, I want you to completely wipe them away. Spill blood. God, do something about all of this. Passages like this can make people really uncomfortable. You begin to look at it and say, well, wait a second, why is this included in the Bible? Because immediately other verses come to mind where we read people like the Apostle Paul saying, listen, all of the Bible is the very breath of God. And not only that, it is useful in life. And so you roll out Psalm 58 and say, okay, if this is from God, how does it become useful? How does this truly become helpful in the midst of life? You saw Psalm 58 is one of a number of what they would refer to as cursing psalms in the Bible. Words where people cry out to God because there's a sense of injustice, either against a group of people or maybe even more specifically against them, and they want something done, and they're willing to give suggestions to God as to how exactly it should be played out. So how do we deal with this? How does this become helpful for us as people who desire to live out God in the midst of all of life? I'm sure for all of us here today, we recognize the reality of anger in the midst of life. And maybe the question isn't whether or not anger exists, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, because we know we have moments of great anger. Sometimes we live lives of incredible anger. And perhaps the better question we ask is not whether or not anger exists or not, but rather how do we respond to the anger in the midst of our lives? A pastor named Tim Keller in Manhattan, New York City, talks about two unhelpful extremes when we look at the emotion of anger. One unhelpful way is to simply ignore it. To simply say, you know what? I'm not going to have anger in my life. That as a follower of Jesus, if someone upsets me or someone makes me angry or mad, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm just going to kind of repress it, and I'm just going to kind of push it way down, kind of sweep it under the carpet. I'm not going to acknowledge it at all in my life. It's unhelpful because it doesn't go away. It eventually will surface itself some other place. And when we begin to repress the anger, what we find ourselves falling into is a kick the cat syndrome. Nothing against cats. I like cats. But I'm sure we've all found ourselves in a situation where someone has angered you, someone has made you incredibly upset, but instead of dealing with the anger, maybe not even with that person or with yourself, suddenly somewhere else down the road, you take it out on someone else. And one of the good indicators that perhaps we are repressing anger in our lives in an unhealthy way is when we chuck a wobbly over a level 2 issue in our life. Have you ever found yourself there? Have you ever seen someone else do that to you, where there might be some little disagreement or some little issue that kind of pops up, and suddenly they go off or you go off on someone? Maybe it's an issue that we have not dealt with anger in an appropriate way. But on the other side of the spectrum, another as equally unhealthy way to deal with anger is to allow it to control our behavior. That whenever anything happens, we immediately act out. We immediately respond. We immediately want to get even. We immediately want to hurt back. But when we stop and we pause for a moment, we realize that is completely unhelpful. It's almost similar to taking gasoline and pouring it onto a fire. It just ignites it even further, and the situation rises in intensity and in elevation. Being controlled by one's anger is often when we fall into the category of responding like Job's wife. You may or may not know the story of Job, but essentially they lost everything. They had reason to be angry. They lost their family, they lost their possessions, Job lost his own health, and finally he is sitting there literally scraping off the sores, and his wife goes up to him and says, "Job, just curse God and die. Just deal with it and be done with it." But how helpful is that? How helpful is it when we allow the emotions and the anger to boil up inside that we just absolutely explode? Does it honestly make the situation any better? So how do we deal with our anger? How do we deal with the reality of what is going on within us? How do we truly understand the words of one of the great thinkers, the Apostle Paul, when he says, "In your anger, do not sin"? You see, Paul was talking to a fellow group of Christians that was really laying out for them what the reality of it looks like when you begin to follow Jesus. And notice he didn't say, you should not have anger. You should never be angry. He says, in your anger, do not sin. So how do we get to that place? How does the reality of Jesus living within us allow us, in spite of what happens to us, in spite of what we see going on in the world that can evoke incredible rages, allow us to respond in a way that Jesus would want us to live? As strange as it may sound, I think a great place to start is in places like Psalm 58. these cursing psalms. He begins by talking about the injustice. He continues by saying what he would like to see happen. But it's so simple, yet so subtle, yet so hard to do, but it can change your life. Is he brought it to God. You see that continual theme throughout this series. You see that continual theme throughout the book of Psalms is that regardless of where the person may have found themselves, they always want to bring it back to God. And that is the place we need to be in. You see, the psalmist is raging at God and not the person. And there's a significant difference because I believe that when you rage against a person or a situation, it only makes your emotions even worse. But rather, when you begin to rage at God in an honest, authentic way, not just simply sweeping it under the carpet and trying to put on that fake, happy plastic smile, but honestly bringing it to God, we are essentially saying, God, I need you to not only deal with this situation, I need you to deal with me as well. And that's where we begin to see transformation taking place. You see, when we rage at the person, we reinforce the emotions. Tony Campolo talks about if you think of malaria, and if you want to eradicate malaria, you don't simply kill the mosquitoes, you eliminate the breeding ground. And Psalm 58 is a perfect example of a follower of God wanting God to deal with the anger in their own life. You see, if you simply kill the mosquitoes and think that is going to eliminate the problem of malaria, guess what? There's a whole lot of swamps that are just producing more and more mosquitoes that are going to cause problems down the road. You have to get rid of the places where these mosquitoes breed so that it will no longer be a problem. And in the same way, when we don't begin to look at the anger and the rage within us by bringing it to God and allowing Him to work in and through us, we may just be killing mosquitoes along the way when we try to repress it a little bit and not honestly allowing God to deal with the breeding ground of the soul, to allow us to respond in positive and helpful ways. By taking our anger to God, we are essentially saying, God, not only do I want you to be at work in this situation, I want you to be at work in me as well. And it's here that we begin to see transformation. You see, the cursing psalms are oftentimes overstatement, exaggeration of what they want to see happen. But they ultimately leave it with God. You notice Psalm 58 doesn't say, listen, God, this is the problem. I want you to break their teeth. I want you to rip them out. I want you to spill their blood. And oh, by the way, I'm giving you first crack at this, because if you don't follow through, guess what? I will. The psalmist is leaving it with God, essentially saying, I may not always understand your ways, but I trust you enough that you know what is right to do. Not only in that situation, but within me as well. A number of years ago, while I was still studying at seminary, I found myself in a situation that, let's just say, was not helpful. I was surrounded by individuals who were less than encouraging, who would say things that were not kind, not helpful, would seem to, no matter what I would do, would just tear it down and attack. I wish I would have read Psalm 58 back then, because breaking some teeth is probably where I would have wanted to land. And in the coincidence of God, I was also taking a course where we were working through the Psalms. And one of the assignments was the teacher says, listen, as you look at the Psalms and you look at the very expressions of faith and the various emotions that people are feeling, I want you to write your own personal psalm to God. So whether it is a sense of sadness, a sense of thanksgiving, a sense of praise, guess what type of psalm I wrote for my assignment? But I started to write, and I fell into the trap of thinking, well, I'm kind of angry, I'm kind of upset, and so maybe I won't use this type of language. And I'm like, no, scratch that out. I don't actually feel that. This is what I want to say. And I simply bore my heart to God. And although it was started out as an assignment, what I began to see was a transformation take place in me. I wish I could tell you that the situation got better, but it didn't really change. Eventually, I kind of removed myself from that place. But what was interesting is because of, I believe, taking it to God and allowing His Spirit to be at work in me, I was able to leave with a sense of grace. Not kind of shake the dust off at their door and say, I hope God gets you. Years later, they invited me back to spend some time. It was amazing walking back into that place. And there was no anger. There was no bitterness. There was no resentment. And it was amazing to see the process that took place because I allowed God into my life. That I was willing to take that step to say, God, this is what I want to do. Here's some suggestions as what I think you might want to do, but I'm going to leave it with you. I think one of the great conversations we need to have with God is to deal with the anger that can so often boil up within our lives. Anger can come from various places and from various situations. Perhaps it's a sense of anger that is built up over the injustice that we see in this world. But I believe that you see it throughout the course of history, that when we bring our concerns and our anger to God, God will use that to bring about often positive change. Think of things like the civil rights movement in the U.S. Individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., who were clearly angry about what was going on in his country. But look at the positive change that has been started and continues in this world. Think of people like Mother Teresa, who just must have been angry at the poverty, particularly in Calcutta. And look what began to happen through her work. If you're in a place of being brought to what Bill Hybels would call a holy discontent, sweeping it under the rug and just saying, well, there's nothing I can do about it, I'm not going to get angry about it, is not the response. Bring it to God so that God can begin to work in and through you to perhaps bring you to a place where He's going to use you to bring about positive change. Perhaps our anger is against another, someone who has hurt us, someone who has done something against us, and it's just building up inside. When we bring our anger to God, the process of forgiveness begins to work. Notice it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. But if we wait for the moment for when we feel like forgiving, I don't know about you, but we wait in a long time. Begin to take the steps that God has shown us, that we know is true, and allow Him to begin that transforming work in and through you. It may not always change the situation, but it can change you and me. Or perhaps your anger is directed specifically against God. That you are angry over something that has happened, something that you feel He should have done. In our anger, when we bring it back to him, it's like we lean into God. And when we lean into God, we say, I am going to trust in you. Even though I may not get it, even though I may not want to do it, I am going to trust in you. I'm not going to be like Job and just curse you and then die. I'm going to trust in you to be at work in my life. There's many injustices that are done in this world. There are many wrongs that are committed against us. But one of the realities that we can begin to live out our faith, to see the reality of Jesus at work, is that in our anger, we bring it to him and allow him to begin to work in and through us to maybe change the circumstance, but to most definitely change you and me. It's a choice we're given to make. Will we deal with it ourselves, or will we allow God to deal with the situation, but more importantly, deal with us? Please stand with me as we sing together.